She found a little boy freezing alone in the snow, wrapped her coat around him, brought him inside, and fed him, not knowing he was the lost son of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city. When his father showed up with 3 armed men to collect him, the child refused to let go of her, and the intimidating Korean crime boss, who had never in his life asked anyone for anything, quietly handed her his private card and asked if she'd be willing to come to his penthouse. She said yes, thinking it was for one afternoon. What she didn't know was that a cold, grieving little boy and his cold, grieving father were both about to decide they couldn't let her leave. If that opening already has your heart racing, you're exactly where you need to be. This channel is home to stories like these: love that crosses oceans, defies expectations, and finds its way through the cold. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't lose this video, and let's get into the story. The boy wasn't moving. That was the first thing Nadia Celestine noticed. A small shape, curled at the base of a park fountain, half buried under a sheet of January snow. His dark jacket blended into the frozen ground like he'd been swallowed by it. She almost walked past. She had coffee in her hand, earbuds in her ears, the kind of Saturday morning focus that belongs to someone who has places to be. Almost. But then she saw the tiny hand, fingers splayed open against the white, completely still, and her feet stopped obeying her. She dropped to her knees, snow soaking straight through her jeans. Hey, baby, look at me." The boy stirred. His eyes opened, round, dark, and glassy with cold. And he blinked at her like she'd appeared from somewhere impossible. His lips were faintly blue. Nadia didn't think. She unzipped her coat, wrapped it around him, and pulled him against her chest. He couldn't have been older than 6. He was completely alone. 11 degrees Fahrenheit. No one else in the park. She held him tight and whispered, "I've got you. You're okay." She had absolutely no idea how wrong she was about that last part. She got him to the coffee shop at the edge of Riverside Park, a narrow, steamy little place called Warm Cup that she'd been coming to every Saturday for 2 years. The owner, Miss Dottie, took one look at the child in Nadia's arms and immediately cleared a booth near the heating vent without being asked. That's the thing about good people. They don't need instructions. The boy's name was Seoha. He told her in a whisper, like even his name had been kept quiet for a long time. He was a pediatric occupational therapist, Nadia, not Seoha. And she recognized immediately what she was looking at. Not just a cold child. A child who'd learned that trust wasn't freely given. A child who watched faces carefully before deciding anything. He ate the sweet tea and buttered toast Miss Dottie brought with the careful urgency of someone who'd been taught not to show hunger. And Nadia felt something open in the middle of her chest. Quiet. Aching. Familiar. She'd already called emergency services. She was asking Seoha gentle questions about his address, his father's name. He knew the building was tall and had a fountain, but not like the park one. He knew his father's name was Guan. And then the door to Warm Cup opened, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The man who walked in was tall. Genuinely, uncomfortably tall. Broad across the shoulders in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Nadia's rent. His face was all clean architecture. Sharp jaw, straight nose, cheekbones like they'd been carved deliberately. His eyes were coal dark and scanning the room with the systematic precision of someone who had spent years reading spaces for danger. 2 men in dark coats flanked him on either side. Seoha went completely still against Nadia's chest. The man's gaze swept the room and found the boy. And for just 1 second, something cracked behind those dark eyes. Something raw and desperate broke through the surface before it sealed itself shut again, fast and practiced, like he'd done it 1,000 times. "Seoha." His voice was low and deliberate. The boy didn't move. He pressed his face further into Nadia's neck. She could feel the child's fingers digging into her sweater. She kept her voice even, though her pulse was anything but. "Sir, he was hypothermic. I found him in the park." He's warming up. Can we have just a few more minutes before... He is my son. The man's accent was precise, his English flawless, his tone making clear that this sentence was the end of all other conversation. I will take him now. I understand that. But he's still cold. The paramedics are on their way. Cancel the paramedics. He said it over her shoulder to one of his men, who immediately reached for a phone. And here's where Nadia Celestine did something that almost no one does when a man like this walks into a room. She stood up, still holding the child, because Seoha's grip had become something she would have needed a crowbar to break, planted herself in the narrow aisle, and looked directly at this man who had never once been told no. You can't cancel emergency services because it's inconvenient, she said, voice steady. Your son was alone in a public park in sub-zero temperatures. He needs to be assessed by a medical professional. The room was very quiet. One of his men shifted his weight. The other watched Nadia with the flat, measuring attention of someone paid to be dangerous. The tall man looked at her. Really looked. Maybe for the first time. Something moved across his expression that she couldn't name. I have a private physician. I'm sure you do. He will be seen immediately. Good. She held his gaze without blinking. Then you won't mind if I walk him to the door. The silence stretched long enough to become something. Then Seoha lifted his head, looked at his father, looked back at Nadia, and in the specific, irrevocable way that small children make decisions that adults spend years trying to undo, he said 4 quiet words. Can she come too? Nobody moved. Miss Dottie had stopped breathing entirely behind the counter. The man in the charcoal overcoat, Guan Taeyang, though Nadia didn't know his full name yet, stared at his son like the boy had just said something in a language he didn't have a translation for. He looked at Nadia again. Long. Measuring. She returned it without flinching, though something about those dark eyes made the back of her neck feel electric, in a way she was absolutely not going to examine right now. Guan Taeyang, he said at last. He didn't offer his hand. My son has decided you are important. I have learned that arguing with him wastes time. The smallest pause, barely a breath. You will ride with us. It was, Nadia would later reflect, the least gracious invitation she had ever received. She said yes anyway. And that was the first mistake. Or maybe the first miracle. She still hasn't decided. The building was, in fact, very tall. It was also the kind of building that makes you feel your own smallness the moment you walk in. Polished stone floors, impossible ceilings, the specific silence of a space that has been insulated against ordinary life. There was a fountain in the lobby. Seoha pointed at it as they passed. See? I told her. You did, Nadia agreed, still holding his hand. The penthouse was stunning and absolutely cold, not the temperature. The temperature was fine. Something else, some quality of air that comes from a space where no one laughs, where no one makes noise just for the pleasure of it, where beauty has been purchased, but joy has not. There were no photographs on the walls, no small shoes by the door, no drawings on the refrigerator, nothing that said a child lives here, only the tiny, stubborn evidence of Seoha. Himself. A book with a dinosaur on the cover wedged between couch cushions, a single crayon that had rolled under the coffee table, a jacket hung slightly too high and slightly off-center on the coat hook, like small hands had done their best. She noticed all of it in 60 seconds. She thought, this boy has been so lonely. Guan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the room, hands clasped behind him. The private physician examined Seoha, declared him recovered, and departed. Seoha wrapped himself in a cashmere blanket on the sectional and watched Nadia with the focused interest of someone who had found something rare and was not prepared to lose sight of it. She picked up her bag to leave. She'd done what she came to do. He walked 2 kilometers in the snow. Guan's voice came from the window, still facing the city. He has never once left this building without security. He doesn't run. He's not a child who runs. A pause that carried something he wasn't saying. He is usually very obedient. Nadia looked at Seoha, who was now watching his father with the careful, weather-reading expression she knew from her work. A child trying to assess what was safe, trying to understand the emotional terrain before stepping into it. She chose her next words carefully. Sometimes, children who are very obedient are obedient because they've learned that expressing needs directly doesn't work, she said quietly. So they find other ways. The silence that followed was not comfortable. You're saying he ran away to get my attention. I'm saying I don't know your son, but behavior is always communication. She should have left after that. She had made her point. She had a life, an apartment, a Saturday that still technically existed. She didn't leave. She stayed because Seoha fell asleep midway through a story about a dinosaur king, and it seemed cruel to stop before the ending. She stayed because the light in the penthouse changed in the late afternoon into something that almost felt warm. She stayed because somewhere in the second hour, she and Guan Taiyang ended up at opposite ends of the kitchen island with cups of tea neither of them had planned to make, and the conversation that had been circling all afternoon finally landed. He lost his mother when he was 2. Guan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his tea. Car accident. I was overseas. By the time I arrived, he stopped. Didn't finish. Didn't need to. He looks like her, he continued, his voice even and careful and carrying something enormous underneath it. In the early years, every time I looked at him, another stop. I was not a good father after that. I worked. I provided. I kept him safe. I attended his important events. His eyes came up, dark and direct, and carrying the specific, exhausted honesty of a man who has stopped protecting himself from the truth. I did not grieve with him. I grieved somewhere he couldn't see, and I think he has been trying to find me on the other side of that wall ever since. Nadia was very still. In her work, she sat with people in the hard places. She'd learned that there was a kind of silence that was not emptiness, but attention. The kind that gives someone room to finish being honest. He asked me last week to learn his mother's juk recipe. The faintest gesture toward the kitchen. I don't have it. The weight of that sentence was enormous. She set her bag back down. He wouldn't eat dinner unless Guan was present. Seoha had told him that directly 3 months ago, the most direct thing he'd said in years. Guan had started coming home for dinner. He didn't know his son was afraid of storms until the night one hit, and a small body climbed into his bed at 2 a.m, and Guan held him for the first time in years, and discovered that the boy smelled like the soap from his bathroom, and that this was information he should have had long ago. She left 20 minutes after that. She told herself she would not think about Guan Taiyang. She told herself the whole afternoon was a strange detour from an ordinary Saturday, and she would file it somewhere and forget it. She failed completely. The call came 4 days later. She was between clients, sitting in her car with a sandwich, when the unknown number came through. Miss Celestine. She knew the voice immediately. He has not been sleeping. Guan's tone was careful, stripped down to the facts. He keeps asking to call you. I told him I would call instead. A pause. He cried for the first time since his mother died. Last night. He cried and I didn't know what to do. She was quiet. I sat with him, Guan said. And the way he said it, that particular weight, like he was reporting something he was both proud of and afraid of simultaneously, made her close her eyes for a second. 3 hours. He fell asleep. But this morning he asked if you were coming back. She looked at the empty evening on her calendar. I have time on Thursday, she said. After 4. The exhale on the other end was barely audible. Thursday, he said. After 4. That Thursday became the next Thursday and the Thursday after that. Not because anyone declared it. It simply accumulated itself into necessity, the way some things do. She worked with Seoha in the ways she knew how. Not as his therapist, she was careful about that line, but as an adult who understood children and was paying close attention to this particular one. They built things with blocks. They made clay dinosaurs, and he could name every species without hesitation. Spinosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Parasaurolophus, which told her everything about how his mind sought safety in cataloged, ordered knowledge. Systems, rules, things you could rely on. She taught him a card game her grandmother had taught her, and he beat her at it by the third session with a focused, unsurprised confidence that made her burst out laughing. He folded paper cranes for her, his small fingers patient and impossibly precise, and left them on the coffee table when she wasn't looking. She watched him find language for things he'd been carrying alone for years. The nightmares about his mother, described in the flat, matter-of-fact way of a child who had processed them in solitude for so long he'd stopped expecting anyone to respond. The way loud sounds made him need to press his back against a wall and find the exits with his eyes. The exhausting mathematics of loving his father and not being able to reach him through all that controlled, protective distance. The loneliness of being the only child in a building full of adults who looked past him at the door, rather than at him. "What do you like doing most?" she asked him one Thursday on the living room floor, engineering kit between them. Seoha thought with the seriousness he brought to most questions. "Being here," he said finally. "When you're here." She kept her expression steady. "What about when I'm not here?" He placed a piece onto their structure, checking the fit. "I like drawing, and I like when Appa comes home for dinner because then the apartment isn't quiet." A pause. It was quiet for a long time. And now? He looked up at her. Less. She thought. This boy has been quietly, patiently, keeping score of every small sign that things are getting better. And she thought, his father has no idea how carefully he's being watched. 3 weeks in, Guan was watching her from doorways. 6 weeks in, he was staying in the kitchen instead of retreating to the window, leaning against the counter, asking her questions about her work, listening with the focused attention he usually reserved for strategy. 8 weeks in, she arrived on a Thursday to find her coffee already waiting on the island, her exact order. She looked at him across the room. "You take it with oat milk and 1 sugar," he said simply. "You mentioned it was the only coffee order you'd kept since your 20s. Fact was doing something to her chest that meant it mattered, and that fact was doing something to her chest that she was not going to examine right now. She told herself firmly on every drive home. She was a professional. She was grounded. She was not going to fall for a guarded, complicated man in an expensive apartment just because he remembered how she took her coffee and had paper cranes appearing on the coffee table and had begun to look at her like she was something he was afraid to look away from. She was so wrong. Here's what she didn't understand yet. Guan Taiyang had spent 10 years making himself unreadable. To his enemies, to his associates, to his own mother. The walls were so complete and so old that even he had stopped noticing them. But Nadia Celestine worked with children who couldn't express what they needed, and she'd spent 15 years learning to read the language, underneath the silence. She wasn't reading his walls. She was reading everything that showed up in the spaces around them. The coffee order, the doorway watching, the way he always knew exactly where she was in the apartment without looking. The way he'd started coming home earlier on Thursday evenings, and then on Wednesdays too, until the overlap between when she was there and when he was home had become significant, and no one had commented on it, but everyone had noticed. Seoha had absolutely noticed. He had been engineering this with the patience and long-game thinking of someone who had decided on an outcome and was prepared to wait as long as it took. The night everything shifted, Seoha had a fever. Nothing serious. 38 degrees, standard viral, gone inside 24 hours. But it was 10 o'clock on a Wednesday, and Guan had called her because Seoha had woken from a nightmare asking for her by name. And Guan had been sitting alone in the dark outside his son's door, and he'd picked up his phone before he'd consciously decided to. She noticed that detail when he told her. He'd called before deciding. That meant something. She arrived in 20 minutes, sat with Seoha until the fear left his eyes and his breathing came back slow and even, rubbed his back and told him the nightmare was done, that he was warm and safe, that she was right here. When the boy finally went under again, she sat in the quiet of his room a few minutes longer, the way you do when someone small has been frightened, and you want to make certain the calm has actually settled before you move. When she came out at midnight, Guan was standing in the middle of the kitchen, not at the window, not at the perimeter. In the middle of the room, arms loose at his sides, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something that had been building for weeks had finally, quietly, arrived. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. The Thursdays, the dinosaurs, the way you explain things to him so he feels capable instead of corrected." He paused. "The way you talk to me." She set her coat over a chair, gave herself a moment. "He's going to be all right," she said carefully. "He's finding his way back to his father. That's what matters most." Nadia. The use of her first name landed differently than expected. He had never used it before. She realized this fully now, that he had been deliberately, carefully keeping it in reserve, and the fact that he was using it now meant the reserve was gone, like a door being opened the rest of the way. "I am not a man who does this well," he said, "speaking about what I feel. I was taught that feelings were information to act on, not to discuss. That vulnerability was a liability." The muscle worked in his jaw. "I have spent 10 years operating under that principle, and I have a son who walked 2 kilometers through the snow to find warmth I wasn't providing." His voice stayed level, but underneath it was the precision of a man choosing every word against the alternative of total silence. "I am not going to do that again." She was very still. 3 weeks ago he wouldn't have said any of that, couldn't have. And now here he was standing in his midnight kitchen, dismantling the last wall deliberately, brick by careful brick, because his son had shown him what walls cost. "I don't know what this is," he said. "What you are to me. I only know that when my son calls you by a word that belongs to someone I lost, I don't feel the grief I expected. I feel something else." He held her gaze. "You made my kitchen warm. This apartment has been cold for years. Not the temperature, something else entirely. And then you walked in and left your card on the island and came back on Thursdays, and I started looking forward to Thursdays. Not as a father grateful for his son's progress." He paused. "That distinction matters to me." She thought about her grandmother, who had told her that the bravest thing you'll ever do is let someone see you without the armor. She had applied that lesson everywhere, except here, in the personal places, because it was always easier to be brave for other people's healing than for your own. She had told herself she was being careful and aware, and professional, and grounded. And then she looked at this man standing in his midnight kitchen saying true things out loud for maybe the first time in a decade. And she understood that careful and real were not the same thing, and that she had been mistaking one for the other for months. "I'm not a liability," she said quietly. "No." One step toward her. "You are the opposite. If this is something, it's something real, with all the complicated parts, the parts that don't have easy answers. I know. I want to know who you actually are, not the controlled version." "I know that too." He was close enough now that she could see the long, genuine exhaustion beneath his composure. A decade of surviving instead of living, of protecting instead of feeling, of positioning himself at the edges of rooms instead of in the middle of them where things actually happened. And underneath all that, something new, something that had finally come in from the cold and was learning, one careful degree at a time, whether it was safe to stay. She reached up and touched his face. Just once. Her thumb at the corner of his jaw, where she'd watched tension live for months. She felt the muscle release under her hand. He closed his eyes. "Thursdays," she said softly. He opened his eyes. "Keep your Thursdays," she said. "And add the other days too." He kissed her. Not impulsive, not desperate, but with the contained and absolute force of a man who does nothing he doesn't mean completely. The kitchen that had always been warm on her side of the island was warm on both sides now, and somewhere down the hall, a small boy slept surrounded by paper cranes, with the unshakable certainty that he had done something quite excellent. Now here's the thing about Guan Taiyang. Once he made a decision, he made it completely. He was not a man of grand gestures. He was a man of presence, of showing up, consistently, in the small ways that actually build something over time. The coffee already waiting when she arrived, now every evening instead of just Thursdays. The morning she came in to find he'd framed 3 of Seoha's drawings without announcing it and hung them carefully in the hallway, the first things on those walls in years. The night he called from a dinner he was supposed to be attending, because Seoha had asked at bedtime whether Nadia would be there tomorrow, and Guan wanted to give the boy an honest answer rather than a convenient one. He began to laugh. Not often, not loudly, but genuinely. A laugh that arrived in his eyes first and then, reluctantly, in the rest of his face, like joy was something he was still learning he was allowed to have. Seoha watched all of it, with the quiet, composed satisfaction of a child who engineered something from the beginning and is watching every piece land exactly where he placed it. "I think he knew," Nadia told Bernice on the phone one Sunday evening. "I think that boy walked 2 kilometers through the snow on purpose." "Honey," Bernice said without missing a beat, "if he did, he is the smartest 6-year-old alive and you owe him everything." Nadia looked at the crayon drawing on the refrigerator. 3 figures, one tall and angular, one with natural hair drawn as an enormous exuberant cloud, one small holding both their hands with arms stretched as wide as they could go, held up by a dinosaur magnet. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I do." He took her to the bridge overlook in February. No occasion, no announcement, just drove there and sat with her watching the water go dark in the dusk. "I blame myself for a long time," he said, "for not being there when she died, for not seeing signs I convinced. Myself I should have seen." He watched the water move. "I think I punished Seoha for surviving, not intentionally, but keeping distance from him meant not having to be inside the grief. I wasn't brave enough to be close to him." He turned his palm up under her hand and held on. "I'm telling you because you should know where I've come from, so you understand what it means for me to be here, fully here, the way I'm trying to be. Not with you. Being with you is the easiest thing I've done in 10 years. His eyes came to hers. To be fully present with my life, to stop calculating how much to hold back from it. Are you still running that calculation? A long pause. Less every day. She believed him, because she could see it everywhere. In how he held his son, in how he showed up, in how he had stopped administering his life from a careful distance and had started living inside it instead. She believed him. She could see the evidence of it everywhere. In how he held his son, in how he showed up, in how he stood inside his own life instead of administering it from a careful distance. The complication arrived when he told her the truth about his business, not import-export, not gray areas. The real shape of it, legitimate holdings that were very large, and older inherited structures built by his father and his grandfather, currently being methodically dismantled because Guan had decided when Seoha was born that he would not pass them on. He told her the legal unwinding was complex and would take another year, maybe 2. He told her who was watching and why. He told her all of it with the flat precision of a man who is not asking for approval, but has decided the person across from him deserves the complete truth, and is willing to sit in the silence afterward and find out what it does. She let him finish. "Are you doing this because of Seoha?" "Partly," he said, "and because I have been living in contradiction for too long, a man who protects the people, He loves while participating in something that endangers people he doesn't know. Those two things don't coexist without a cost. I finally decided I was done paying it. She thought about her grandmother who had lived by principle without ever pretending it was simple. She thought about Seoha, who had survived his losses by finding what was real and holding on with both hands. Then let's not waste the time we have, she said. The relief in his eyes was enormous, the wonder. It looked like a man discovering, at 34, that the life he'd built could still be changed into something worth keeping. You are the most remarkable person I've met, he said. I found a cold kid on a bench. No. He reached across the island and took her hand. Unhurried, deliberate, absolute. That is not all. The wedding was in October. Seoha wore a miniature version of his father's suit and carried the rings with the gravity of someone who had been trusted with something important and intended to honor that trust completely. He walked the short aisle with his chin up, eyes on Nadia, and when he reached her and held out the pillow, he leaned up and whispered, I picked the rings. The box is gold because you like warm colors. I remembered. She had to blink 3 times before she could see clearly. Guan stood at the end of the aisle in charcoal and white, and when she walked toward him, Bernice at her side, the October light doing everything it does when the moment asks it to. Something happened to his face that she had never seen before. Not the corner of the mouth almost smile, not the controlled warmth, something unguarded and complete. He looked like a man who had finally fully come in from the cold. He said yes the way he said everything that mattered. Quietly, completely, without ceremony, because ceremony is for things you aren't sure of. His voice said, This I am sure of. When she said it back, his hand tightened around hers. Seoha, who had been holding his breath through the entire ring exchange with the compressed intensity of someone who had significant personal investment in this outcome, let it out in one long, satisfied exhale and then announced to the nearest guest at full volume, That was the one I picked. Laughter filled the room. Guan's jaw moved into that almost smile, fully committed for once, and Nadia leaned up and kissed the corner of his mouth and felt the smile complete itself under her lips. Later, when the music had started and the evening was becoming exactly the October night it was meant to be, Guan pulled her close at the edge of the dancing and they stood together without speaking. Seoha had been spun in circles by Bernice, who had driven up from Atlanta, declared Guan terrifyingly handsome but apparently worth it, and immediately adopted him, until the child was shrieking with pure, unguarded, unreserved joy. That sound rose above everything else in the room, clear and enormous and utterly free. He's laughing, Guan said quietly against her temple. He is. He wasn't before. A pause. I wasn't either. She lifted her face and looked at him. This was what she hadn't been prepared for. Not falling in love. That, in retrospect, had been inevitable from the moment she looked at a cold child in a park and followed the thread. What she hadn't prepared for was standing inside the life built from all those Thursdays, all those midnight kitchen conversations, all that careful and effortful and chosen openness, wearing a ring a 6-year-old had picked out because he remembered she liked warm colors, watching a man who had learned to laugh again actually laughing, and feeling, in the most complete and uncomplicated way, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Thank you, Guan said. Not polished, not controlled, the rawer version, the kind of gratitude that isn't about the specific thing, but about every single thing that came after it. For the bench, for staying, for all of it. You did the hard work, she said. You opened the door. You knocked. You kept the door worth knocking on. He kissed her then, to the sound of his son's laughter and October music and the whole gathered life around them. She kissed him back with everything she had. The practical part, the careful part, and the part that had known, standing in a cold park with a stranger's child pressed against her chest, that something had begun and that she was about to follow it somewhere beautiful. She was right. Outside the October windows, the first light snow of the season was beginning to fall. Soft and unhurried, the way the best things begin, not announcing themselves, just arriving, accumulating slowly, changing everything until one day you look up and find the landscape transformed. A cold boy on a park bench, a business card on a kitchen island, Thursdays that became Wednesdays that became every evening, a paper crane, a gold ring box, a child who decided, with the unimpeachable logic of someone who needed warmth and went looking for it, that she was his. He was right. She was. Inside, no one was cold. If this story reached you somewhere real, drop a comment and tell me which moment broke you open. Was it the boy whispering about the gold ring box, or the midnight kitchen, or the first time Guan said her name? I want to know. And if you want more stories like this one, deep love, real emotion, the kind of romance that doesn't look away, subscribe right now and hit the bell. New stories land every other day, and the next one is already coming. Don't miss it.